Ibara is probably the worst villain in Dr. Stone. I mean, yeah, you could say Hyuga, but that almost feels like cheating. I mean, the guy was a villain for like 2 seconds. Ibara, on the other hand, had his own arc and admittedly did do a very good job of what he was created to do. But when you compare him to the other villains, especially someone as badass as Stanley Snyder, well, Ibara just doesn't look that good. And with the potential for Y-Man to be the series' best villain, that could cement Ibara at the bottom of the list. So in this video, I want to discuss what makes Ibara Dr. Stone's worst villain. Be warned that this will contain spoilers. Before I get started, make sure to comment with your thoughts on Ibara. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week in the next video. This week's comment goes to Mamsie, who shared his thoughts on Laguna from Eden Zero. If you'd like more Dr. Stone and other manga discussions like this one, then make sure to subscribe and follow along with each week's video. Now, before I go on my tangent about why Ibara is the worst villain, let me just be clear about something. Ibara is still a great villain. When you compare him to the sexy lion man that can one-punch everybody, or the cartoonishly evil scientist that has an epic catchphrase, then yeah, Ibara does look pretty mundane. But if you don't judge him by comparison and just look at what he accomplishes, Ibara stands out as a great villain. Just think about what Inagaki probably had going on in his mind when he made this character. I mean, he probably had Aladdin in his mind because he is basically just the discount version of Jafar, but that's just obvious. What Inagaki probably wanted for Treasure Island was a character that was the complete opposite of Tsukasa. Tsukasa had been the story's main threat for ages by this point, so it was about time for a nice change of pace. And with Ibara, it kinda ended up being a complete 180. First of all, Tsukasa is an absolute snack. Ibara, on the other hand, is, well, a dusty old skeleton. Unless, of course, that's your thing. I mean, a dilf is a dilf is a dilf. Then there's the fact that Tsukasa had this philosophy that made his actions arguably justifiable, while Ibara kinda just wanted to be a pervert. Plus, at least Tsukasa is a chill dude. Ibara is just a dick. He does have his chill moments where, he's actually kinda funny, but for the most part, he's just a sleazeball who only sees people as a means to an end. So while Tsukasa was this redeemable character who a lot of people liked even while he was a villain, Ibara is just a gross old man who is flat out unlikable as a person. Not unlikable as a character though, because again, this is what he's meant to do. He's meant to make us cringe. We're supposed to not like him because he's meant to be a completely different kind of villain from Tsukasa. And another way Inagaki pulled this off is by not making him OP. Tsukasa was smart, but his claim to fame is obviously his raw power. And on top of that, he is incredibly charismatic, which is scary when you realize how easily he can get people to follow him. But Ibara's strengths are almost the complete opposite. According to his VIP file, Ibara was a decent fighter in his prime, but that's not really how he does things. As his file tells us, there's 2 things that make Ibara so scary: his cunning and his vigilance. His attention to detail borders on the line of paranoia, making it nearly impossible to pull off any kind of secret plan. Scarier than that is his cunning. To be clear, he isn't smart like Zeno or Senku, who have all this knowledge of the natural world and use it to build a plan. Ibara's intelligence is more in the area of being able to predict your next 5 moves and beat you to the punch, even when he doesn't know the first thing about science. So when you combine these skills together, you get a villain who happens to notice one little detail of a plan the characters failed to hide, and suddenly uses that against them in a battle of 4D chess. And this was the terror of Ibara. One wrong move, and he basically had your entire scheme figured out. Combine that with his total disregard for anyone's life besides his own, and those devilish panels from Boichi, and Ibara is just an all-around great villain. But at this point, you've clicked on a video titled The Worst Villain in Dr. Stone, and all I've done is talk about how great he is. So understandably, you're probably wondering how he's the worst villain. Well, like I said, you shouldn't just judge Ibara by comparison because you'll miss the things he does really well. But when you do, well, it's pretty easy to see why he's far from the best villain in Dr. Stone. Earlier in the video, I said that Ibara doesn't have any big picture philosophy, and all he really wants to do is be a gross old man. And while that does make him a great villain in the sense that it makes him classically evil and therefore unlikable as a person, it also undermines his potential as a threat. See, with Tsukasa, part of the threat was that even though his execution of it was freaking stupid, his philosophy was actually pretty rational. You couldn't help but feel like Tsukasa was kind of right, even though what he was doing was clearly wrong. And this is great for two reasons. First, because it makes Tsukasa a more sophisticated character, meaning we as readers have more reason to engage with him and pick him apart. Second is because it posed a challenge to the central idea that science is a good thing. The characters couldn't just say that science was as awesome as Senku made it out to be. They had to prove it by showing that science was the better way to solve the world's problems. So not only was Tsukasa himself a fairly sophisticated character, but his presence in the story challenged the ideas we were told from the very beginning, thereby adding nuance to the narrative. With Ibara, that just doesn't happen. He's just a pervy old man who likes to manipulate people. That's it, no dreams of world domination, no evil scheme for world destruction. He's just a classically evil villain. But see, the thing with these so-called classic evil villains is that even they can be sophisticated characters. Because if you look at Zeno, right, he's pretty much your textbook evil villain. He has an evil lab, an evil laugh, evil minions, plans for world domination. The dude just screams comic book villain. And unlike Tsukasa, he doesn't have a philosophy that makes him sympathetic. His whole reason for being evil is because he thinks ethics get in the way of science, and so the only way to reach new levels of scientific knowledge is to replace the old world order with his own. He's doing it all purely for selfish reasons. But even if you can't sympathize with Zeno like you might with Tsukasa, there's other elements to him that, when considered together, make Zeno a complex character. Even though he is clearly evil, he still cares for his close partners. Especially his life partner, who Inagaki has basically found a million ways to say he's his boyfriend besides just saying he's his boyfriend. So while Zeno is willing to kill people in the name of science, he still cares for other human beings. And even though he claims to be above ethics and traditional views of morality, Zeno clearly admires Senku and his way of doing things. And we also saw that even though he saw him as a complete and total goofball, Zeno clearly respects Byakuya and what he was able to accomplish. So it might seem as easy as saying everything Zeno does is for science, but it's really not. There are these conflicting elements that make Zeno a fascinating villain that you can't just sum up in one or two sentences. But with Ibara, you can absolutely do that. He's a crafty, pervy old man who is drawn to power and likes to control people. That's it. He doesn't have a motivation that makes him redeemable, and there's nothing he struggles with that adds layers to his character. So when you compare Ibara to Tsukasa, a sympathetic villain, and Zeno, a classically evil villain with a fair amount of nuance, he just comes up short. He doesn't add anything to the broader narrative, he doesn't push Senku to grow as a character, or even show us some side to Senku that we hadn't seen yet. Ibara is really just an obstacle that needed to be overcome. Which again is not to say he's a bad villain per se. There's plenty to like about his character, even if he is an unlikable person. And his cunning and vigilance make him a great threat to the main characters. But what separates the best villains from other villains is that they're not just great villains, but they're also great characters. On top of posing a threat to the main characters and setting the plot in motion, they themselves are well-written characters. You could watch JoJo's Part 3 and completely forget why the Stardust Crusaders went to Egypt, but it's hard to forget the absurdity of Dio and all of his iconic behavior. You probably don't remember why Batman needed to go to Hong Kong in The Dark Knight, but you will always remember Heath Ledger's Joker dressed up as a nurse or giving those famous "why so serious" speeches. Fans will inevitably forget the plot of a story, but it's the characters we invest in and connect with. Which is why top-tier villains also tend to be great characters who leave a lasting impression. But Ibara just doesn't do that. He's a great villain, but he's an okay character at best. And unfortunately, this is likely because Inagaki only wanted to use him as the obstacle for Treasure Island. Think about it, do you know how boring Treasure Island would have been without Ibara getting in Senku's way? It's exactly why we needed a character like Ibara, to force Senku into those games of 4D chess. But that meant Inagaki could only add so much to his character unless he wanted him to stay in the story. Otherwise, it'd just leave loose ends. And speaking of loose ends, we never really got a backstory for Ibara. We know he was a soldier who rose to power by kissing up to the master, but nothing that shows us what motivates his character. If we'd been given something like that, then this might have been an entirely different conversation. But that's not what happened, and for whatever reason, Inagaki only wanted to use Ibara as the obstacle for Treasure Island. Of course, Inagaki still does a great job with Ibara in crafting him as a major threat, but he's still just an obstacle to be overcome. So, despite all his strengths, this is why Ibara is the worst villain in Dr. Stone. And that's it for this discussion. If you enjoyed this discussion, then make sure to like the video. Also make sure to comment with your thoughts down below. And if you'd like more Dr. Stone and other manga discussions like this one, then make sure to subscribe and follow along with each week's video. Thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.